Thank you, Chair, and good morning. My colleague and I, Libby, are joining you from the lands of the sovereign unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we'd like to begin today by paying respects to ancestors and elders, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. VCOSS is the peak body for Victoria's social and community sector. We have more than 300 member organisations, including many organisations who helped people during and after the Victorian floods of 2022. After those floods, VCOSS conducted about 50 one-on-one consultations with these community organisations, and we also convened a wider community feedback forum in Northern Victoria. Our submission today will draw on these insights and the expertise of our members. We don't have specific expertise in insurance law and regulation and would defer on technical matters to our colleagues that you've just heard from, some of whom you've just heard from, Consumer Action Law Centre and West Justice, together with the Financial Rights Legal Service and Choice, who, as you are well aware, provided a comprehensive submission on behalf of consumer advocates. We do, though, know when something is broken. We know when people aren't getting what they need when they need it, and we know when change is required. As we consulted after the floods, one of the biggest issues we heard was the inadequacy of insurance. The message was loud and clear that the insurance system isn't working, and that the market failure here is entrenching poverty and making people more vulnerable to future disasters. Specifically, there are three main problems that I'd like to step through. The first being the attitude of insurers after the floods, which was often quite cavalier and combative. The second is insurance being unaffordable to many and underinvestment in disaster mitigation, increasing the costs of insurance. And finally, we will raise the issue of the burden that insurance inaffordability places on community services who are already under pressure. Firstly, on insurer attitudes and behaviours, those who lost their homes and belongings in the Victorian floods told us that insurers push back on them and push back again until a person simply gives up. And then finally, when the insurer does agree that there is flood damage and there should be a payout, we heard they pressure customers to accept a cash settlement, which is so low that it doesn't cover the true cost of rebuilding. We heard about people being kept in the dark about the status of their claims for months at a time, and delays which required people to put their lives on hold and forced many to struggle through another winter in a caravan. A massive power balance exists here. Customers are taking low cash settlements or copying the hardship that follows because it feels like they don't have much other choice. So we need to change the way that insurers treat their customers. Insurers should cover customers' full accommodation costs until rebuilding works are completed, rather than leaving them in the lurch, and they should attribute damage after major floods to the flood, rather than making unreasonable claims about pre-existing issues and wear and tear. And insurers need to keep people updated regularly on their claims. The second problem highlighted is the barrier to accessing insurance. Roughly 60% of homes affected by the October 22 floods were either underinsured or not insured at all. And that number is going to keep growing for two main reasons. Firstly, adequate insurance simply costs too much, and premiums continue to rise in disaster-prone areas. People can't afford insurance when they're struggling to put food on the table, pay their energy bills and medical expenses. The second is that insurers are outright refusing to cover some people in flood-affected areas, and indeed are withdrawing from entire regions because of high risk. The consequences are as tragic as they are predictable. People living in flood-prone areas without adequate insurance are being pushed into poverty, and in the words of one resident we spoke to in Northern Victoria, "Flood insurance will be unaffordable around here from now on. My home's worth nothing." Government's role in addressing this issue is a long-term one, and it means having genuine conversations with communities about addressing risks and building community resilience to future disasters. This should involve mitigation and genuinely place-based community solutions. The third aspect is the impact on the community sector when the insurance system fails. The community sector has put in a Herculean effort to support people directly with their insurance problems and to help people deal with the flow-on impacts of insurance failure. In terms of direct support, one financial counselling service we're aware of was able to secure a cash settlement for a low-income client that was 8 times what was originally offered. Community services have been there to help when insurance issues push people into homelessness, contribute to family breakdown, or force people to return home when their property is still mouldy and unsafe. But community organisations are under pressure, both generally with rising demand and specifically in disaster-affected areas. So in summary, Chair, insurance companies need to act better. Governments need to invest more in disaster mitigation to reduce premiums, and community services need to be recognised and adequately resourced to do their critical work. I thank you again for the invitation to speak here today, and we're now happy to answer any questions.
No, thanks very much for appearing. Now, I understand that you've got a bit of a constraint time-wise, 11:45 or maybe a bit longer, so we won't try and push you too much beyond what's reasonable. Look, I'll just start off with a couple of very quick questions, then hand over to committee members, because I know they've got a lot of questions. So firstly, just on that issue of the attitude of being cavalier and combative, one of the suggestions from the previous witnesses that there needs to be better training. Do you think that goes part of the way, and is there anything else you would suggest?
Yes, definitely. Training is a part of the suite of mechanisms that I think will encourage insurers to be fair and reasonable, especially when when people are facing trauma. We're talking about people in post-traumatic stress situations, and definitely training is a part of the solution. There are a number of other things that could be done as well, for example, we have suggested that a number of improvements could be made to the code of the code of practice for insurers to really ensure that insurers are playing fair and working with their customers rather than against them.
I would add,
one of the issues that you've raised. Oh, sorry.
I would add, VCOSS members work with people that are vulnerable, often have low literacy levels, people that live with a disability. People in the community come to a crisis like this with a range of capabilities, education levels, and their ability to navigate the system. So VCOSS strongly believes that insurers need to be trained in not just working with people that have the capacity to engage in very complex systems, but also with people that have low literacy, English may be a second language, with the true diversity of people in the communities that have been impacted by this natural disaster. Thank you.
No, thanks, Ms. Buckingham, and that's certainly an issue for my electorate. So that's a point that I think many people in my electorate would see as first order, both dealing with insurers and then many other entities. Look, I'll just ask one more question and then hand over to committee members. So an issue that you raise is rental costs during the building process, and this is obvious. This has been an issue that's been raised with me by some constituents, and I'm sure that's the case with other committee members. And obviously, for somebody going through all of the trauma of a building, a rebuild, and one that might take an unexpectedly long period of time, this can be particularly difficult. I suppose I'm just curious about the ways in which we might juggle this and not lead to unintended consequences. For example, if you were to have a mandated inclusion in every policy that there'd be full rental cost coverage for the entire building process, presumably there might be some people who may not want necessarily that full coverage. They could potentially come up with solutions for themselves. I'm just wondering, do you think this is the kind of thing which maybe you might have as a default inclusion that people might be able to opt out of it if it's not necessarily something they need?
Thank you, Chair. And I think you're right. I think it is a mechanism that should be available to customers and policy holders. And if at the end of the day, the wishes and the requests of the policyholder or the customer need to be honoured and respected in the insurance process, and that may mean that under certain circumstances things are offered to a particular person, but for whatever reason that person doesn't want to take that up or wishes to have alternatives, and I think that's reasonable.
I think I'll just add that one message we would really like the committee to take away from our consultations and our experiences is that the impact of temporary housing and unsafe housing is devastating on the people in these communities, and every effort by insurers, the government, the community sector to ensure people are in stable housing that is safe is a top priority, because it has such impacts on people's mental health, physical health, education, ability to participate in society. And we've really heard that people are putting their lives on hold because they have very insecure housing while they wait for their claims to be heard and their permanent housing to be restored.
And in some contexts, that raises the question as to whether in areas where there's just a shortfall of housing, full stop, whether government or industry or both need to figure out ways of stepping in with boosting a reasonable standard of housing at short notice. And I think this is something we've seen increasingly implemented. We saw it in Townsville recently, but my sense is this is something which a lot of consumer advocates are saying we need to look at in more depth. Yes,
we would agree. There were some useful examples in Victoria of the use of modular homes, but very not a lot. And I think there are some innovative models that could be explored to really address what is, as you have said, a very chronic housing crisis generally and specifically in disaster affected areas.
Great, thank you. I'll hand over to Mr. Newman.
Now, the aspect of that $741 million Queensland Government and Australian Government Resilient Homes Program involved applications to resilient retrofit your property or raise your house, or indeed some voluntary buybacks. Can you explore that? Can you recommend that particular program be expanded to include all states and territories, and I presume also a permanent program? So can you tell us where that worked well and why you're suggesting that be expanded?
Thank you. And I think we would say that the Resilient Homes program provides a suite of tools to be used at the customer's election to address some of the issues which are causing insurance premiums to be so unaffordable, or causing the sorts of insurance practices that we say are unacceptable. So I think to answer your question, the idea of having a number of tools made available to communities is something we would like to see, and it is something that may require a community by community approach, but definitely the idea of government coming together, government, state and territory in fact, coming together, and I note that program was jointly funded by the Queensland Government and the Federal Government. So governments coming together to discuss what are those range of options available and where do communities, what do communities want, is really vital.
My final question before I hand it on to my colleagues is the issue of any particular barriers in that program that you might have looked at my observation on the ground was there was questions about the building envelope, and that was the definition of eligibility, and that meant that the roof or the main structure of the home had indeed to have been impacted. But people's properties, particularly in peri-urban areas or peri-rural areas, are often more than just the house. They're often sheds, they're often dams, they're often structures on the property. Are you aware of any? I think that's a potential barrier, by the way, and it needs to be broadened. But are you aware of any other barriers in that program that you think could be attended to in the design of that program being rolled out across the country?
My colleague may have more, Livy may have more to answer in relation to your specific question, but I think what I would say broadly is that there's always learnings from these projects. This was sort of the first one of its kind. There will be things that were done very well and things that can be improved next time. And I think a structured process of reflection and of learning from the experiences in Queensland would be invaluable in considering how this scheme might be rolled out more broadly.
Thanks, Juanita. I think what I would add is the reason we are attracted to that scheme is it actually provides funding and an acknowledgement that it's not just up to the individual homeowners to mitigate against the risk of these unprecedented natural weather events, that there is funding from government to support them in taking mitigation. And while I'm sure there are things that we could improve on the existing scheme, we here at VCOSS believe that that would make a really material difference to a lot of people that are living in high risk areas that can't afford exorbitant insurance premiums, and it's more of a longer term approach so that we don't suffer the same calamity that next time there's a severe weather event.
Yeah, thanks very much. That recommendation is very, very helpful, I think. It is not the same type of fund as the Disaster Ready Fund, which deals with drainage and community hubs or levees or dams or etc. That's a different thing. This is individual families and homes. And the final aspect on that is, in the case of, say, a body corporate where some units owners want to sell and others don't, one of the barriers in that program was indeed the opposition or objection to some unit holders or landlords selling and not being prepared to sell. What's happened there in that particular program, if your information, is that the federal and state governments have agreed there to compulsory acquisition, even though this is an aspect of voluntarism on this particular program, to get around it. So that's an idea that could get passed as well. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much. Ms. Templeman.
Having invested money and done the work, should it lead to a lower premium for that home or as part of that community rating that is given?
Yes, I think we would say we agree with that proposition, and it should mitigate against rising premiums, because if your house is more resilient and resistant to flooding and other natural disaster risks, then it follows that the insurance premium should reflect that.
Which is not necessarily what we see when it applies to bushfire, where there are rules around how resilient your home has to be when you rebuild, but we don't necessarily see that translated into lower premiums, because the actual cost of the rebuild, and then in future years if it did burn down again, the cost of rebuilding that. So it's really I think this is going to be a really interesting thing to explore about what our expectations as a community are about the consequence of certain measures that are taken, and then how the industry seeks to use that, whether it's to mitigate its own costs as opposed to ameliorate the effects of high premiums for us. So yeah, thank you for raising that. And look, I know we're really tight on time, so the one other thing I wanted you've made a comment about the percentage of homes that were underinsured or uninsured, and that's going to rise. In terms of those who are not insured, what do you see as the safety net for uninsured homeowners?
Thank you. And I think there is a role here for those uninsured homeowners. There's a role for government here to explore insurance affordability for low-income homeowners where premiums just are untenable for homeowners who are, as I mentioned earlier, struggling really to put 3 meals on the table for their families, and insurance premiums feel like a nice to have and not a must have. So I think there is more work to be done here on insurance affordability more generally at that low income household at that level.
And you mentioned in the submission that you're seeing some people lose their insurance while their claim's being processed. What I've been seeing in the Hawkesbury region is that they've been able to maintain insurance generally while the claim's being done, but then the next year's insurance premium is either exorbitant or not offered.
Yeah.
Look, thank you.
That's okay.
What you've given us is really valuable. It's good to hear from that Victorian perspective.
Thank you. And if I could just make a general comment around what you've described there, insurance premiums are one of a number of pressures on families and households who are also simultaneously dealing with rising mortgage payments, rising costs of living, and so this escalates and it compounds as well. And the flow-on impacts of that include, poorer mental health, disconnection from schooling, and all those other social problems that our sector faces. So the sector helps with every day. But when you cumulatively look at the picture of what's happening for households in flood-affected areas, it's really quite significant.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Mr. Irwin. Mr. G.
Yes, thank you very much for your submission and also for your evidence. I know there are tremendous time constraints on you, so I'll try to be reasonably brief as well. I was just reflecting on the opening remarks that you made about the power imbalance between policyholders and insurance companies. And I was just wondering how, for the benefit of folks who are listening at home and also to the committee, how vulnerable are people and residents and community members after a major catastrophe and disaster like a storm and flood event?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you for this question, because I think there's a real range of vulnerabilities. Some people have the financial means, the social means to recover more quickly than others. Through our consultations and our work with our members, one thing that has come through really strongly is people that are isolated and do not have as many social connections are increasingly vulnerable, as are people that are where English may be a second language or recently arrived to the region. They also experience certain vulnerabilities. They have a lot of strengths, but in navigating the insurance system, the scales are really tipped against them, and then what we see is that power imbalance, that's where the community services sector really steps in. So people that may be of low literacy, for example, may be living alone, may be elderly, if they can access a financial counsellor or legal support, they're much more equipped to travel through this process that can be very combative. And so that's where we see a bit of the power balance a little bit evened out. But for many people that don't have access to those supports, they are very vulnerable to just accepting the first offer, accepting what the insurance company says on the first blush, and they never even enter the process of review or complaints processing, and they're living with the consequences.
I'm from the Central West in New South Wales. I have constituents who are still deeply traumatised from the storm and flood event of November 2022. And the way that I see it is, for many of my constituents, this has been the most traumatic experience of their lives. Many have lost everything: home, contents, some have lost businesses, everything. It is complete and utter devastation, and it puts strains on their finances, tremendous strain, especially if they've had an insurance knockback, and also on relationships as well. I find that the constituents are very vulnerable, extremely vulnerable. And I was interested in your comments about, your opening comments about the insurers pushing back until a person gives up and pressure customers to accept a cash settlement. And I guess that would include, are we talking about low ball offers here, like low offers and pressuring them to accept it, possibly by dragging out claims? Is that what you're talking about there?
Yes. And you've also heard some excellent evidence from the consumer advocates who presented before us this morning on some of those insurer practices and tactics which just simply are unfair and often legally unreasonable.
So is that, and that is why I guess you've basically, in your submission, you've said that the insurance code of practice needs to change, it needs to be amended, right?
That's correct. Yes, we think there are a number of improvements that can be made to the code, and we've listed some of them in our submission. But generally, there is a system in place already today, as was mentioned earlier, to hold insurers to account for their own commitments to their own good practice. And if those commitments are robust and are properly adhered to and properly, there are proper avenues for complaint, then, that certainly creates a fairer system for people who are engaging with the insurance industry. But we would like to see a lot more best practices up front and a lot less reliance on, adversarialism or complaints processes to get what we would see often is just a fair deal.
So an example which you've mentioned in your submission relates to cash settlements. And if you look at the Code of Practice under Clause 79, it says this: if we offer a cash settlement under a home building policy, we will provide you with information to help you understand how they work and how decisions are made on cash settlements. That's it. It's not really adequate, is it?
We think there is room for improvement in the code.
Okay, thank you.
Just on cash settlements, we have heard evidence of people accepting cash settlements that are not sufficient for them to fully recover. And what it also does, and I think you would have heard this from the consumer advocates this morning, it also shifts the responsibility, the accountability, the mental load of a rebuild onto an individual when they are at their most vulnerable and traumatised. And those outcomes are, I think we can all work for better outcomes for those individuals that then are left with a cash settlement that's not sufficient, and the incredible challenge of rebuilding in this environment.
And so I guess the pressure to take a cash settlement increases if the alternative is paying for a solicitor, a building expert, and a hydrologist to take on an insurance company who has all of those things.
Exactly. And time. I've got a quote here from somebody that we met in Echuca. I am just tired. People are being worn down until they make decisions that are not in their best interest and not in their community's best interest.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. G. And look, there were obviously many more questions the committee could have asked you. We may come back to you with some questions on notice, but thank you very much for your time today.